Hello, everyone, and welcome to another lecture on Nirod Chandra Chaudhury's The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian. Now, in this lecture, we will be going into the text and we will try to understand that what does Chaudhury try to achieve in the text itself. So, in book one, we have a glimpse of the early environment in which Nirod Chandra Chaudhury grew up. So first he talks about his birthplace. So Kishorganj in the Mymensingh district of East Bengal was the village where he was born, and this was situated on the banks of a little river which they called their own Nile. The river was the primary source of all forms of traffic, and often boat races took place on this little river stretch. However, there were no mosques, but there were a few brick houses in the nearby area. Life in the rainy season was very hard, and it was very difficult to get out of the house because of all the mud and slush that accumulated. Crows and miners were frequent as birds, and so were the palm trees which grew on the river bank. Now, the coming of winter was celebrated by lighting bonfires, roads were cleaned, and basically houses were whitewashed. And a folk ritual was performed for one whole month, and they also enjoyed the sight of the colorful orchids. Occasionally, gypsies came and were encamped on the outskirts of the village, and their pigs were dirty, but their children took keen interest in them. Then came the spring season, and beautiful flowers grew all around, and their house, that is the house where Chaudhary lived, was a spacious one which had a number of rooms called huts and courtyards, and the rooms were decorated with the pictures of Hindu gods and goddesses. Now, a number of fairs and festivals were held, and this brought great joy to the children, and the festivals were celebrated with due solemnity. Now, they lived in a small town and were so well knit by the social and economic factors, and social relationships played a very important role in their lives. Now, there were frequent quarrels, and people got killed from time to time, and they could frequently see a dead body being carried for postmortem, and robberies were also frequent. Now, this is one of the pictures that Chaudhary paints of his very early life. And this is a very interesting picture because it does not only talk about the positives of his early life but the negatives as well. Then he goes on to talk about his own ancestral village, which he says that his ancestral village was called Bonogram, and they visited it every now and then, and many of their close relatives still lived there. They were considered to be the landlords of the village, and their position was one of a very distinctive nature. Now, Bonogram influenced them profoundly. They were proud of it and considered it to be their real home. Their uncles were all very proud of their rank and status and considered themselves to be superior people. Their house in Bonogram was called the New House, and it was very spacious and had wide and an open landscape. And there was nothing but greenery as far as one could see. The family deity was installed in a spacious courtyard. It was a joint deity and was called by them Gopinath or Gopinji. There was also the idol of the Lord Vishnu. Now, mythological plays were frequently staged, and the children took keen interest in them. Excuse me. Thus, early in life, they became familiar with the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. They always looked forward to the Durga Puja, The festival was celebrated in four phases lasting over a month, and Chaudhuri has given a detailed account of it in the text itself. The sacrifice of goats and buffaloes to the goddess Kali particularly interested him, but particularly interested the people, but Chaudhuri himself was disgusted by it. His parents did not like Bonogram because of its old fashioned ways. His father had left for Kishorganj with only 8 annas in his pocket, and since then he had his links with the ancestral village severed, and he was not sorry for it. Then Chaudhuri goes on to talk about his mother's village. The name of the village was Kalikach. It was situated at a distance of 5 miles from Ajapur on the river Meghna. It was surrounded on all sides by thick woods, and the landscape was plush green. And Chaudhuri remembers that he loved the landscape as well as the sunrise and the sunsets, which were beautiful. They visited the family 6 times between 1904 and 1905, and the boys of the family were being educated in schools at different places. Now, then the family fell on evil days, and financial constraints were apparent, so his father did not visit his mother in law as it meant heavy expenditure to entertain the son in law in the traditional way. Even his mother's visits meant heavy expenditure. So the people of the village loved folk poetry and folk music, which was traditionally played on ceremonial occasions. The population consisted both of Hindus and Muslims, and so there were frequent quarrels. But the morality of them was simple. It was on the basis of the simple morality that Brahmoism was founded in the village. And Chaudhuri was married in a well to do family of Shillong. It was there that he saw the Englishman in flesh for the first time, and it was a beautiful place, Chaudhary remembers, full of colorful orchids. Now, next he talks about his experience with England. Though Chaudhary had never been to England, he visualized it to be a very beautiful place, and he imagined it to be half land, half water. Early in life, he became familiar with a number of literary, political, and historical figures of England, and he also became familiar with the names of a number of historical and political events. Thus, he came to know the names of the American War of Independence, the Boer War, the Anglo Turkish War, and the names of the people connected with these wars. The name of Burke, Edmund Burke, fascinated him, for Burke had delivered an eloquent speech in connection with the impeachment of Warren Hastings. In his father's library, he read works of a number of well known literary figures of England. He came to know about Homer and his epics through the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. He came to know about Milton and Shakespeare, who were his favorites and were profound formative influences on Chaudhary. They were liberal pacifists in their political views, and so the liberals of England were their favorites. They read of England in books and imagined it to be very beautiful, and they began to love the country and its people. And this early reading made him an Anglophone in later life. They loved cricket because of its typical Englishness. The picture of English ships fascinated him, and he always thought of England as a country, once again, which was half land, half water. However, he was carried away by the superstitious stories about the Englishmen. They thought they were descended from monkeys, and so they were very fond of bananas. So Chaudhuri is very quick to interpret the stories that he has heard. And so fact and fiction keep on meeting and they are all colored by his impression. So Chaudhuri also imagined that English children acquired their fair color for they were bleached in wine from the very beginning, and that they had a very typical attitude. And even Chaudhuri's own attitude towards the English was that of a love hate. But his father took the pains to kind of give them a saner attitude towards the English. And English women with their blue eyes fascinated him. The wife of the district commissioner had blue eyes, and she was therefore a special object of their attention. Now we move on to book 2. In book 2, Chaudhuri talks about the first 12 years of his life, and he begins with his birth, his parents, his early years. An autobiography is never chronological, and Chaudhuri adopted and appropriated this unconventional way of first giving an account of his early surroundings and his early formative influences in book 1, and then coming to an account of his birth and his first 12 years of his life. He was born on 23rd of November 1897 at 6 a.m. the local time. Though they belonged to an aristocratic family, his parents had no faith in horoscopes. They were partly deists, partly monotheists, and partly nationalists. So these were very difficult cross currents at the time. And Chaudhuri had Chaudhuri were 8 brothers and sisters, and all of them, contrary to the tradition, were born in the father's home and not in the mother's home. And his father acted as the head of the family and was in full control of its activities. His word was the law. His father did not change all his life. He was healthy and firm. His appearance of harshness was deceptive, as he was really gentle and mild in reality. Now, he was simple in his dress, in his habits, in his manners. He did not like to criticize others. He was an intellectual who took good care of the education of his children, and he cared for worldly success and prosperity and thought of education as a means to achieve it. Now, for this specific reason, he also took care of their health and saw to it that they took to regular exercise. He himself taught them grammar, and Chaudhuri was interested in the living use of a language and not in the theory of grammar. So when he was 10 years old, he was handed to the care of a tutor, and he learned English from his father without tears but with toil, as Chaudhuri himself tells us. Though his father was a man of strong will and firm character, he never encroached on their freedom of action. His mother was a pious and religious woman who disliked falsehood, dishonesty, and moral cowardice. So she tried to inculcate these qualities in her children from very early childhood. Now, she also was a superstitious woman, and she believed that her mother in law had laid a curse upon her, and so she never enjoyed spiritual happiness. And she felt lonely in a very spiritual sense. Now, this inner frustration made her liable to fits of hysteria, and this disease killed her before her time. At the age of 12 years, when he went on a journey with his parents and saw trains and steamers for the first time, he was fascinated. And he had multiple pets. Chaudhuri had multiple pets who he was very fond of. Now, at this time, Chaudhuri talks about the Indian Renaissance. The Indian Renaissance was a synthesis of the East and the West, And it was a historical movement which altered our way of looking at the world. And it began in the early decades of the 19th century and reached its peak by the turn of the century. It took about 100 years for it to come to full swing, and there are far reaching influences of the Indian Renaissance on Chaudhury's formative mind. The growth of Bengali humanism was a part of the Bengal Renaissance, and it began with the founding of the Hindu College in 1919 and was accelerated by the teachings of Michael Madhusudan Dotto, Dirozio, and the other scholars and social reformers of the time. Now, their initiation into this Bengali humanism took place very early in life when they saw the pictures of Toru Dotto and Oru Dotto. Now, they took a large course in the study of Bengali and English literature in earnest, and though they did not read Sanskrit, but they derived some understanding of the language and of the literature from their study of Bengali literature. Now, when we think of religion, they believed in the existence of ghosts and spirits, and also in a number of gods and goddesses, in magic, in ritual, in Brahmoism, and in the revivalism of Bankim Chandra and Swami Vivekananda. But they were equally monotheists and polytheists, so they are not quite decided on this front. And the mystery of death remained unexplained to Chaudhuri, very much like the nature of ghosts. And the theory that the souls were reborn appealed to him most of all. Now, they were never imparted any systematic religious indoctrination or any education in this matter. So, Chaudhuri never developed a spiritual or a religious life per se, but his moral education was more thorough and systematic. And Brahmoism and revived Hinduism were both helpful in this connection. Now, these new influences had considerable impact on Chaudhury's character and on his conduct. And his permanent source of moral teaching were the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which represent the conflict of good and evil, with good being always victorious by dint of being good itself. Then he talks about the early nationalism. Now, Chaudhuri got his earliest initiation into nationalism with the partition of Bengal and the agitation which ensued. Now, this happened in October 1905, and the boycott of English goods began from that period. And they were swept forward by the emotional fervor of the first national agitation and resented the restrictions put on the freedom of expression. They felt helpless and they felt suffocated. They felt deliberately silenced. Now, a number of patriotic songs helped to keep up their morale, and an eagerness to serve and sacrifice was blooming in them. That is, they must be dedicated to the service of their country. And this patriotic zeal also generated a hatred towards the English. The moderates were looked down upon and they became more and more extremists in their outlook. Now, efforts were made to achieve a Hindu Muslim unity, but instead of unity, there was a discord and there was an increasing amount of religious fanaticism which could easily be seen at this period. This Hindu Muslim discord was further intensified by the prospects of handing over the power to the Indians, and there were riots all over. revolutionaries who believed in violence gained ground, and this was followed by a deliberate and desperate repression on the side of the government. Now, they were fascinated by the idea of violence and armed rebellion. Now, training in arms was secretly imparted, and after summer vacations, they were sent to the high school, sent not to the high school, but to the national school, which was a school of a different kind. And during this time, his mother fell ill and she was to be taken to Calcutta for treatment. So they sold off their property at Kishoreganj in 1910 and shifted to Calcutta after a short stay in Bonogram. In book 3, Nirod Chandra Chaudhuri talks about his education. I am trying to give you the crux of what Chaudhuri is trying to achieve in the 4 books of the autobiography of an unknown Indian in this lecture. So, therefore, I am going book by book, argument by argument, and I am trying to present to you what Chaudhuri has said in this video primarily, so that you have a clear cut idea that what you are going through. Now, in book 3, he talks about education, and when he talks about education, he talks about Calcutta itself. Now, Chaudhuri lived in Calcutta for 32 years, starting from 1910 to 1942, and the city had considerable influence in molding his personality during the formative years of his life. When he came to Calcutta, he found that the large city was divided into 3 parts. On one side lived the Bengali, on the other side lived the English, and in between these 2 parts was a middle part which was kind of populated by the Eurasians and the Muslims. Now, back then, Calcutta was an international city, and it was vast and filled with towers and churches which could be seen rising high over the other buildings. And there were towers, temples, and mosques all over Calcutta. Victoria Memorial at the time was under construction, and it was to be another landmark of the city. At every 1,000 years or so, one could see bamboo masts with a bird table on the top for pigeons. And there was a field with a large park, and the city stood round it in as if a rough arch. There were also museums like the British Museum, of which Chowdhury was very fond and he visited it frequently. The Bengali population was primarily poor, and they went to work in morning and returned in evening. In reality, although Calcutta belonged to them, the rest were foreigners. The city was full of lanes and by-lanes, alleys and shabby houses, and the poor people lived in the shabbiest parts of the city. They were the slum dwellers and enjoyed no basic amenities of life. Their condition was horrible. The winter and the rainy season especially made Calcutta unbearable for these people, because primarily people were afraid of pneumonia in these seasons. So you see, when Chaudhuri talks about Calcutta, he does not only talk about Calcutta in light of uh, just its great buildings and its great mansions. Now, in this regard, I would ask you, since the book is near my hand, coincidentally, I would ask you to read this book. If you can read Bengali, it's a beautiful book. It's a very thin book. It's called Hotobhagar Kolikata. If you can read Bengali, by Sukumar Shikdar. Uh, this is from uh, Onushtup. You can find it in College Street. This is a brilliant book, and why do I ask you to read it? Because this talks about not only the Calcutta of great mansions and great buildings, but it also talks about a Calcutta which is long forgotten, which is the Calcutta of the poor people. Now, when you read texts like Hutum Pacha Noksha, or when you read texts like Alaler Ghore Dulal, or so on and so forth, you get a small, brief picture about the poor people of Calcutta. But when you actually read such exhaustive texts, then can only you understand that what the poor people were going through. So, if you can read Bengali, please read it. Then he talks about the experiences of his adolescence. Chaudhuri had first stayed for 4 months for the sake of his education in Mymensingh, as his father had not yet settled down at Calcutta. Mymensingh was dusty, dirty, shabby, and was full of stench, and Chaudhuri was disgusted with it. He did not want to return to it in the next session, and he felt lonely in the city. It was for the first time that he had to live away from his parents. Secondly, he had no friends in the city, and the boys in the school were all snobbish, and he could not endure their behavior. But the sight of the majestic Brahmaputra on which the town stood comforted him. The engine shed and the railway yard were also fascinating to him, and soon he learned that his father had established a prosperous business in Calcutta, and that it was certain that he would go there in the next session. They were in Calcutta during the next session, and he was admitted to a good school from where he matriculated. But his school life was one of great disappointment. The students were indisciplined and had little regard for their teachers. They also lacked any form of intellectual brilliance, but the literary atmosphere was more lively. There were literary societies, and their activity excited Chaudhary. And Chaudhary knew about these from a cousin who was a university scholar and who resided with them. So then Chaudhary talks about the good library of English classics, which he had himself and which he made use of. Now, beside his English teacher, was a man of varied literary tastes. He was a poet, a critic, and it was this influence of the teacher that laid a lasting impact on Chaudhuri as a writer. Now, there were communal riots, and so in the beginning of 1911, they shifted to Baliganj, a semi rural middle class suburb. Can you imagine Baliganj being a semi rural middle class suburb? I mean, today. So, must have been brilliant back in that time. And his father had fallen seriously ill. It was advised that he should completely rest and that peace of mind was necessary. And the Baliganj back then could provide it. Not today, definitely, but back then, yes. It was a spacious house, and here he could freely indulge in his hobby of gardening. Now, in 1911, after he recovered, Chaudhury's father began to subscribe to an advanced literary journal which they read with interest, and Chaudhuri thought on what he read, and this too contributed in making up his mind as a thinker. Soon, Chaudhuri also made his first acquaintance with the Encyclopedia Britannica and studied easily from volume to volume, and it was a great source of knowledge and inspiration for Chaudhuri himself. Consequently, after his father's illness, his business suffered and it was eventually ruined. Ultimately, they had to leave Calcutta and return to Monogram, and so they did so in December of 1912. And they remained at Monogram for about 6 months. Then their father decided to return to Kishorganj and restart his practice as a lawyer, and they were prosperous once again. But Chaudhuri and his elder brother had to come back to Calcutta alone for higher education. This is a very interesting period of Chaudhuri's life because here he was a citizen slash student. In Calcutta, Chaudhuri began to live in a lodge, which in Bengali is called a mess. And he was a student and a citizen with a taste for politics at the one hand, and taste for literature on the other. Now, in the mess life, he went through a lot of hardships, and the life was very dull. And so he moved to the hostel of Oxford Mission very soon. And this change became necessary owing to his ill health. Between 1912 and 1915, the revolutionary movement gained ground, and they were conscious of its growing influence even in Calcutta. And his younger brother, then only 14 years of age, joined a group of revolutionaries, but Chaudhuri and his brother were not interested in it. They kept aloof from it. During the vacation of 1913, Chaudhuri came to Monogram and studied about the Russo-Japanese War. Now, the father prior of the Oxford Mission Hostel patronized him and helped him on a number of occasions, but the other boys accused the father of having made insulting remarks about the Indians. Now, when Chaudhuri and his brother did not agree with the attitude, they were called yes men and sycophants. The War of 1914 took Chaudhuri kind of by surprise, and while he favored the Allies, the other boys were with the Nazis, and he remained an Anglophile all his life, though he loved India in his own way. In September, he went to Bonogram and on return deeply plunged into military studies. Now, from the history of military science, he passed on to the study of the technique of warfare, and he tried to learn the elements of guns and aviation, and was also into drawing sketches of guns and aeroplanes. By the end of 1915, revolutionary activities increased and the demand for home rule was openly and loudly voiced. The Defense of India Act was passed, and many of Chaudhuri's friends and relatives were arrested. He and his elder brother could avoid trouble with the police, but his younger brother in Bonogram could not do so. The cause was a little instrument that Chaudhuri had made. The result was that in 1916, the entire family was sent to Calcutta by his father, and one day the younger brother absented himself from home for a long time. When he refused to disclose his whereabouts, he had to be flogged. After this, he completely gave up his revolutionary activities. But the police kept a watch on him, and it was with difficulty that he could get a passport to go abroad. On return, he became one of the leading physicians of Calcutta. And Chaudhuri appeared in his BA course in 1918, and after that, political activity remained suspended with him for quite some time. Then he talks about his initiation into scholarship. Chaudhuri had a rare scholarly temperament, and so he studied every branch of learning: literature, diplomacy, history, you name any other subject. He had a special passion for the study of history, and he wanted to become a professor of history. This was his goal in life. His teacher of history, Professor Bipin Gupta, deeply influenced him, and he was influenced also by the Professor T.R. Glover, and he listened attentively to his lectures on Christianity and the Roman Europe. Now, among the books, Constitutional History of Stubbs, Green's Short History of the English People, and the History of Rome deeply influenced him. He was also influenced by Comte's positivism, Mill's works, and essays of Huxley, and Belloc and Bussolt's view of history. Encyclopedia Britannica continued to be a permanent source of inspiration, and he also acquired a profound. I'm sorry, the network is causing a lot of trouble. So I think I'll have to stop this lecture over here and continue the next day. Okay, I'm extremely sorry, but the network is very unstable and it might shut off at any point of time. Thank you so much for listening. In the next class, I'll conclude this. Okay.